Before the Beatles became the biggest band in the world, before they changed music and culture forever, there was another drummer in their story. A name that time has largely forgotten. His name was Pete Best, and for a brief but critical moment in the Beatles' history, he was their drummer. But just as the Beatles stood on the brink of worldwide fame, Pete Best was abruptly dismissed, replaced by Ringo Starr, and left behind as his former bandmates became global icons. This is the story of Pete Best, the forgotten Beatle, and the part he played in shaping music history. Pete Best was born Randolph Peter Best on November 24, 1941, in Madras, British India. His father died when Pete was young, and his mother, Mona Best, eventually moved the family to Liverpool, England. Mona played a key role in Pete's future involvement with the Beatles. In 1959, she opened a coffee club in the basement of the family's home called the Casbah Coffee Club. The Casbah quickly became a hotspot for Liverpool's young musicians, offering a stage for rock and roll bands to perform when many other clubs rejected this new music. Among the first groups to play at the Casbah were the Quarrymen, the precursor to the Beatles, featuring John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison. In 1960, John, Paul, and George were preparing to travel to Hamburg, Germany, where they had secured a lengthy residency at the Indra Club. However, they lacked a permanent drummer. Their previous drummers had been unreliable or unavailable for the Hamburg trip. Needing a drummer fast, they turned to Pete Best, who had played with a local band called the Blackjacks and had already performed at his mother's club. Pete auditioned and was invited to join the Beatles just days before their first Hamburg trip in August 1960. Pete's solid drumming style helped complete the Beatles' sound during those early, wild nights in Hamburg. The group played long sets, sometimes 7 hours a night, honing their musical skills and stage presence. It was in these grueling conditions that the Beatles began to gel as a band. Pete's contribution to this formative period of the Beatles' history was significant. His steady backbeat provided the foundation for the group's energetic rock and roll covers. Audiences in Hamburg and back in Liverpool recognized Pete's good looks and quiet demeanor, and he quickly gained a following of his own, especially among female fans. By the time the Beatles returned to Liverpool and began playing regularly at the Cavern Club, their reputation was building fast. However, tensions were beginning to develop behind the scenes. While Pete was popular with fans and had been instrumental in getting the group started, the other Beatles reportedly felt he didn't fully fit in with their growing creative and personal bond. Accounts from that time suggest that Pete was more reserved than John, Paul, and George, who shared a sharp sense of humor and a close-knit camaraderie. Musically, some argue that Pete's drumming lacked the versatility and flair that the Beatles' evolving sound required. But whether these differences were musical, personal, or a mix of both, they set the stage for what would happen next. In 1962, after returning from their third Hamburg stint, the Beatles secured an audition with EMI's Parlophone label, with producer George Martin at the helm. During the 1962 audition at EMI's Abbey Road studios, Martin reportedly expressed concern about Pete Best's drumming. While polite, Martin suggested that the band might want to use a session drummer for recording purposes. Although this was a common practice at the time, John, Paul, and George interpreted this as confirmation of their growing doubts about Pete's role in the band. Shortly after the audition, the Beatles decided to replace Pete Best. The task of delivering the news fell to their manager, Brian Epstein, who informed Pete in mid-August 1962 that he was out of the band. For Pete, the dismissal came as a shock. He had no indication that the others were planning to let him go. In his place, they recruited Ringo Starr, who had played with another Liverpool group, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and had previously filled in for Pete during a few gigs. Ringo officially joined the Beatles in time for their recording of Love Me Do, the song that would become their first hit. The Beatles' career skyrocketed shortly after Ringo joined. Within months, they were charting hits in the UK, and by 1964, they were leading the British invasion of America. Beatlemania swept the world, and John, Paul, George, and Ringo became household names, cultural icons whose influence extended far beyond music. Pete Best, meanwhile, was left behind. In the years following his departure from the Beatles, Pete struggled with a depression and a sense of betrayal. He played with a few other bands, including the Pete Best Four and Lee Curtis and the All-Stars, but none achieved major success. Eventually, Pete left the music business altogether and took a job as a civil servant, working for the British government in Liverpool. For decades, Pete rarely spoke publicly about his time in the Beatles. He lived quietly, married, and raised a family, while the band he had once been a part of continued to be celebrated around the world. Despite being written out of the Beatles' official story for years, Pete Best's role in their early development was undeniable. Without him, the Beatles might have not made it to Hamburg, might have not honed their sound on those grueling German nights, and might not have been ready for the opportunities that came their way. Over time, attitudes toward Pete Best softened. In the 1990s, as interest in the Beatles' early years grew, Pete re-emerged in public. He published his autobiography, appeared at Beatles conventions, and performed with his own band, the Pete Best Band. His contributions were finally acknowledged in 1995 when the Beatles released the Anthology 1 album, which featured several tracks from their early recordings with Pete on drums. For his contributions to those recordings, Pete Best received a share of the royalties, earning him a long overdue financial reward for his part in the Beatles' journey. Pete Best's story is one of talent, timing, and heartbreak. He was a capable drummer whose skills served the Beatles well during their formative years. But as the band evolved and sought a tighter, more dynamic sound, they made the painful decision to move on without him. His departure from the band was a turning point in the Beatles' history, clearing the way for the lineup that would conquer the world. Yet, Pete Best's life did not end in bitterness. He built a quiet, fulfilling life away from the spotlight, finding happiness in family, and later embracing his place in rock and roll history. Fans and historians now recognize his contributions, not as a footnote, but as an essential chapter in the Beatles' rise to fame. In some ways, Pete Best became a symbol of how fame and success can turn on a single moment and a single decision. One day, you're a part of a struggling rock and roll band, and the next, you're left watching your friends become the biggest stars the world have ever seen. Pete Best's story reminds us that history often remembers the victors, but that behind every success story, there are people whose contributions paved the way, but who were left behind when the spotlight arrived. His life is not defined solely by what he missed out on, but by the resilience he showed in building a meaningful life beyond the Beatles. Today, when people look back on the Beatles' origins, Pete Best's name is mentioned with respect. He is remembered not as the man who missed out, but as the drummer who helped launch the most important band in rock history. His journey is a testament to the unpredictable nature of fate, to the pain of missed opportunity, and to the possibility of finding peace and purpose beyond disappointment. Though Pete Best never played on the Beatles' biggest hits, his rhythm helped set them on their path. Without Pete Best, the Beatles' story would not be complete. Like, comment, and subscribe for daily history and culture content.